Montana Territory, July 1874. The sun blazed low over the Bitterroot Valley when Isaiah Lorne spotted a figure stumbling through the tall grass, too small to be a man, too clumsy to be a deer. He lowered his rifle and narrowed his eyes. A woman, alone, miles from the nearest trail. He stepped off his porch, boots crunching dry earth, and started down the slope. His cabin sat tucked into the trees, away from the old wagon roads most folks had forgotten. He liked it that way, quiet still. Just him and the land. But that woman was lost, and the way she moved, staggering, turning in circles, told him she was scared. By the time he reached her, she had dropped to her knees beside a cluster of sage. Her bonnet hung askew, curls damp with sweat. She looked up fast, startled, chest heaving. "Do not come closer," she said, voice hoarse. "I will not," Isaiah said. "But you should not stay out here. There is no water for miles." She blinked at him. Her lips were cracked. Her dress, once cream-colored, was streaked in dust and torn at the hem. Her hands trembled. "I think I took the wrong cut off the trail," she whispered. "I kept thinking I would find the creek. But it is not here." Isaiah nodded. "You are 5 miles north of it. You passed the turn." Her eyes filled fast, tears rising and slipping down her cheeks. She wiped them with a shaking palm. "I have never been this far west. I should not have come alone." "Where were you heading?" "Deer Lodge," she said. "My brother was supposed to meet me at the station. He never came." Isaiah crouched nearby, not reaching for her, just letting her breathe. "What is your name?" "Winona Alder," she said. "I came from Kansas. I was supposed to start over." Isaiah's jaw tightened. He knew what it meant when someone said that. "You are lucky I saw you. If you had wandered south, you would have ended up in the canyon. No one finds you there." Winona looked down at her hands. "I was trying to be strong. I thought if I just kept walking, I would find something." Isaiah stood and offered a hand. "You found me." After a pause, she took it. It was nearly dark when they reached his cabin. Winona moved slow, limping slightly, her boots not built for this land. Isaiah led her to the bench outside and filled a tin cup with water from the barrel. She drank, eyes closed. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and stepped inside to stir the fire. The old stove gave off a low heat. He laid out a blanket on the cot against the wall and pointed to it when she stepped in, arms wrapped around herself. "You can rest there," he said. "I will sleep outside." "You do not have to, I will." Later, after she had fallen asleep, he sat on the porch watching the moon rise over the distant peaks. He had not spoken to anyone in weeks. Not truly. He had built this life alone after everyone he loved was buried back in Tennessee. The quiet had become a companion, but now it felt too large. Inside, Winona turned in her sleep and whispered something he could not hear. He stayed awake until the stars thickened, listening. The next morning, she woke early. Isaiah was chopping wood out back, sleeves rolled to his elbows. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him. "I can help," she said. Isaiah looked up. "You do not need to. I want to." He handed her the small hatchet and guided her toward the kindling pile. "Watch your thumb." She smiled faintly. "I am not completely helpless." He raised a brow. "You were lost in the valley." She let out a soft laugh, the first real one. "Fair." They worked in silence for a while. The wind moved through the pines. A hawk circled above. "You live here alone?" she asked. "I do." "No family?" Isaiah shook his head. "Not anymore." She nodded. "Me neither." When the sun reached the high trees, he brought her down to the creek. They walked slow, the path narrow and shaded. She stepped carefully, but her limp had worsened. He noticed. "Let me see your foot," he said when they sat by the water. "I am fine." "You are not." She hesitated, then unlaced her boot. Her ankle was swollen, bruised, deep red. Isaiah crouched and touched it gently. "You twisted it bad. Should not be walking on it." She looked away. "I did not want to be trouble." "You are not," he said, firm but quiet. She glanced at him then. "Why did you help me?" Isaiah looked at her, really looked. The way the light touched her cheekbones, the curve of her mouth, the wary hope in her eyes. "Because you were alone," he said. And I was too. She did not speak, just stared at him for a long moment. Then nodded. They stayed there by the creek, the cold water running over their fingers. She leaned back against the tree trunk with a sigh. I never told anyone, she said. But I was supposed to marry. Back in Kansas. He left before the wedding. Took all her money. Isaiah's jaw clenched. I am sorry. I thought I would never feel safe again, she said. But I do now. Here. He blinked. That quiet truth hit deeper than he expected. He stood slowly. Come. I will carry you back. She started to protest, but his arms were already around her. She weighed so little. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he felt every breath she took. Back at the cabin, he set her down gently on the cot. I will fix your boot, he said. She smiled. You are not what I expected out here. What did you expect? Someone colder. Or cruel. He glanced at her. I used to be harder. Then I realized there's no use in it. She reached for his hand. Thank you, Isaiah. He looked at their joined hands. You do not have to leave, Winona. She met his eyes. I was hoping you would say that. And then, just like that, something shifted. Not fast, not loud, but sure. The way her fingers curled into his. The way his body leaned toward hers without thinking. She was not lost anymore. And neither was he. A light rain came 2 days later, soft and steady, turning the dust outside Isaiah's cabin into dark, fragrant earth. The roof held, patched long ago with pine tar and leftover canvas. Inside, the air cooled and Winona sat near the stove, her foot elevated with a folded wool coat beneath her heel. She was mending one of Isaiah's shirts, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. He watched her from the table, knife in hand, stripping bark from a length of willow. The silence between them was easier now, not heavy. It settled like an old quilt, familiar, unspoken. She didn't look up. You don't throw much away. Can't afford to, Isaiah said, fingers steady. Takes too long to get more. Even shirts that ought to be buried? He let out a low sound, half a laugh. That one's seen 5 winters. Thought it earned a 6th. Winona ran her thumb along the finished seam and set the needle aside. I'd say it has. He pushed back from the table and crossed to the window. The rain had eased to mist, clinging to the needles of the tall firs. Down the slope, the creek swelled, running faster over the rocks. I've been thinking, she said, folding the shirt. If I'm to stay on a while, I should contribute more than just taking your bed and eating your bread. Isaiah turned. You're not a burden. That's not what I said. He studied her. What did you do in Kansas? Before. I taught reading and figures to younger girls. In my aunt's parlor, mostly. She rented me out to neighbors when she could. Her voice stayed even, but her hands folded tighter around the cloth. You could teach here, he said after a moment. She raised her eyebrows. To the trees. He shook his head. To the ranchers' children east of the ridge. They've got no school. I pass their land when I ride to the trading post. They asked once if I knew anyone. She stared at him, eyes narrowing slightly. You never said. I didn't know then if you'd want to stay. She looked down at the shirt in her lap. And now? I'd like you to, he said. But only if it's what you want. Winona smoothed the fabric once, then set it aside. I'd need paper. Chalk. A slate or 2. I can trade for those. She leaned back, thoughtful. You do that for me? His jaw shifted. I do it because this place has been quiet too long. I think it'd do better with your voice in it. Her eyes flickered, something old and careful softening. Then I'll teach. That afternoon, Isaiah hitched the mule to the cart and loaded it with hides and smoked meat enough to barter with the trader outside Stevensville. The rain had stopped, but the air still held its weight. Winona walked beside him as far as the bend in the trees, her ankle wrapped neat beneath her skirt. I'll be back by dusk, he said, adjusting the reins. She nodded, arms tucked under her shawl. Don't forget the chalk. He gave a slow smile. I won't. She watched until he disappeared into the trees, wheels creaking faintly over the wet trail. Then she turned back to the cabin, her limp easing as she moved. She gathered pine cones for kindling, checked the bread rising near the stove, then stood on the porch and let the wind pull at her curls. By the time Isaiah returned, the sun was low and the sky streaked in rose and gold. The mule came in tired, but steady, and the cart clattered to a stop just outside the porch. Winona stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you find them?" He pulled a canvas sack from beneath the seat and handed it down. 2 slates, chalk, a few tablets, and a surprise. She opened the sack and smiled, slow and full. "Ribbons. Figured you'd use them before long." "I will," she said, voice quiet. That night, over a supper of beans and cornmeal cakes, the light between them shifted. Not sudden, just a leaning closer, a passing of the tin cup without needing to ask. Her hand brushed his when she reached for the kettle, and neither of them pulled away. Later, as he banked the fire, she touched the edge of the quilt he kept folded by the cot and said, "Would you mind if I stayed out here tonight? Just for the air. It feels kinder than it did before." He nodded. "I'll bring your coat." She settled on the bench with her feet tucked beneath her, the stars coming clear in the sky above. Isaiah sat nearby, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the sound slow and steady. After a long stretch of quiet, she turned to him. "What made you come west?" He set the knife down, hands resting on his knees. "I didn't feel at home where I was. Thought maybe I'd find something different here." "Did you?" "Not at first." She looked at him then, her voice soft. "And now?" He didn't answer right away, just held her gaze. "Then maybe I have." She didn't look away. "So have I." The morning air had a bite to it, sharper than the day before. A buckskin sky stretched wide above the hills, and a thin layer of frost traced the edges of the cedar shingles. Isaiah stepped outside with his rifle slung over one shoulder and a strip of dried apple in his teeth. The mule needed checking, and the elk trail he'd followed last week might have turned up something useful. Winona stood by the chopping block, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sorting through a bundle of dry herbs she'd found near the creek, bend yarrow and horehound mostly, though she wasn't sure of the rest. "You planning to hunt today?" she asked, not looking up. He paused, adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "If the trail's still warm." She nodded, separating the stems. "I'll keep the fire going, and I'll try to boil down the rest of that tallow. It's starting to smell strange." Isaiah glanced at the pot she'd set aside yesterday. "Let it go too long and it'll turn slick. Might not hold a wick." "I know," she said. "I've done worse, though." He gave a faint nod and stepped off the porch. By midday, the sun had burned off the frost. Winona sat at the table beside the open window, working over the slates Isaiah had brought. She'd carved out letters with a bit of soapstone, testing how smoothly they held. The waxy dust clung to her fingers. She didn't mind. The quiet now had a different shape to it, no longer hollow, more like a space she could stretch in. She glanced toward the back wall, where a bundle of dried corn hung in the rafters. There were things to do, and she found comfort in the rhythm of them. But her eyes drifted to the trail more often than she meant. When Isaiah returned near dusk, he carried a hare in one hand and a pouch slung low across his back. His boots were caked in mud, and a scrape ran along his forearm. "You're hurt," she said, already reaching for the basin. He set the hare on the porch rail and unshouldered the pouch. "Barbed vine. Caught me when I slipped the ridge. I've got burdock root steeped already," she said, wetting a cloth. He watched her hands as she worked, quiet as ever. But when she dabbed the edge of the wound, his fingers twitched. "You've done this before," he said. "I used to tend the neighbor's boy, always falling off things." He looked at her, his voice lower. "You're good with pain." She wrung out the cloth. "Most women are. They just don't speak of it." He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into the pouch and pulled out a folded square of cloth. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a spool of thread and a narrow-handled brush. "I traded the hair before I skinned it. Thought maybe you'd want this." She studied the brush. "For ink. Figured you'd need one if you're teaching proper." Her fingers closed around the handle. "I don't know what to do with someone who thinks ahead like that." "You get used to it," he said. She laughed once, then stood. "I'll stew the roots for a salve." You'll want it by morning. He followed her inside, the scent of wood smoke curling through the rafters. He hung his coat by the door and she stirred the pot without saying much else. The stew thickened and the hare roasted slow in the clay dish he'd carved by hand last winter. Later, as twilight settled deep into the trees, Winona stood by the fire, turning the brush over in her hands. I came here with nothing but a satchel and a name, she said. I didn't know if either would be worth much. Isaiah looked up from his chair. They are. She held his gaze. I still don't understand how you knew to find me that day. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I didn't. I was just looking to see what the wind had brought in. Sometimes it carries more than weather. She stepped closer. You've been alone a long time. He nodded. Long enough. Her voice dropped. And you're not afraid to stop? He stood slowly. Not if you're here. They didn't move fast. Her hands settled against his chest and he laid his palm over hers like sealing a promise. No rush to it. Just two people standing in the hush of a cabin made solid by time and care. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The fire crackled low and the moon rose steady, casting pale lines across the worn floorboards. She stayed near him, her breath even, her step certain. And when he reached for her hand again, it was not out of need but recognition. Something true already growing in the quiet between them. The first time the children came up the narrow slope to Isaiah's cabin, it was just after the last frost had lifted from the ground for good. Winona stood waiting by the old stump she'd cleared of moss and scrub, a slate in one hand and her shawl tied close at the throat. The children were shy at first, two girls and a boy from the ranch eastward. Their boots were too big, cheeks ruddy from the climb. Isaiah had gone down to the low field that morning, clearing brush before spring growth swallowed the trail. When he returned near midday, he found Winona seated on a flat stone, her voice soft but clear as she guided the boy's hand through the motions of a letter. The girls leaned over their slates, brows furrowed, lips moving silently with each shape they traced. He paused just beyond the trees, watching. She hadn't seen him yet. Her hair had come loose on one side, a streak of charcoal dust high across one cheekbone. Yet she looked steady, sure. He didn't interrupt. That evening, after the children had been led back down the ridge by their father, Winona stood by the fire pit, brushing ashes from her skirt. They're quick, she said. The younger girl can already count without using her fingers. Isaiah poured water into the basin. You looked like you belonged to that place. She glanced over. What place? The one where things grow. She said nothing for a breath. Then I don't feel like I'm waiting for something anymore. He looked at her hands, which rarely sat still. You still carry yourself like you expect to be asked to leave. I suppose I've been asked before. You won't be here? Her shoulders lowered slightly. I believe you. That night, they ate by lantern light, not out of necessity, but because she liked the way it softened the room. Isaiah carved a thin strip of cedar while she repaired a fraying hem. The rhythm between them had changed, less cautious, more lived in. When she glanced up, he was already looking. You said once you had no kin left, she said. But you never said how. He set the knife down. My brother went first. Fever took him in '68. My mother passed before the war. My father never came back from it. She folded the cloth in her lap. Did you fight? He shook his head. I was 17 when it ended. Too young to enlist. Too old to forget. She didn't ask more. Instead, she reached for the kettle, poured him a measure of the chicory root they'd roasted together 2 nights before. I sometimes wonder, she said, what my life would have been if I'd been born a man. If I could have chosen my path without consequence. Isaiah accepted the cup. What would you have chosen? I'd have built a place like this. With my own hands. I'd have stood still when I wanted to, moved when I didn't. She met his gaze. But maybe I didn't need to be a man to do that. You didn't, he said. Later, as wind moved through the trees, she stepped out onto the porch alone. The stars were brighter after the rain, and the air smelled of pitch and thawing pine. Isaiah joined her, pulling the quilt she'd left on the rail around her shoulders. Do you ever miss the towns? She asked. The sound of other people? Sometimes, he said. But it fades. She leaned against the post. I used to think I had to chase noise to feel real. Now I think I just didn't know how to be quiet with someone. He didn't speak, just touched her hand where it rested beside him, his fingers warm against the chill. She turned slightly. Would it be all right if I moved my things into the main room? He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice held no hesitation. It would. Inside, the fire cracked gently. Outside, the woods held their breath. And between them, something that had begun in silence settled deeper, like roots finding their hold. The first thawed spring brought more than warmth. The days lengthened, and so did the chores, but neither Isaiah nor Winona minded the work. It was honest and shaped their time together in quiet ways, such as the way she'd learned to turn the soil with the heel of her boot while he cleared stones for a vegetable bed, or how he'd begun to leave his tools where she could find them. Unspoken trust passed between them like a shared glance. One morning, Isaiah returned from the eastern ridge with a bundle of cedar saplings strapped to his back and news of a traveling preacher coming through the valley. He dropped the pack at the edge of the porch and leaned his hat against the doorframe. "He'll be at the ranch house in 3 days," Isaiah said. "Could bring the children to be baptized if their folks want it." Winona wiped her palms on her apron. "Did he say where he's headed from there?" "North, toward Fort Owen." She looked down at the rough grain of the porch rail. "Would he marry folk, do you think?" Isaiah's gaze settled on her, steady. "If they asked him to." The stillness between them wasn't heavy. It was full, like something ripened just enough to be picked. "I suppose we could ask," she said, lifting her eyes. "If we wanted to." Isaiah stepped close, his boots quiet on the boards. "I want to." She let out a breath, slow and sure. "So do I." They didn't speak of dresses or rings. She didn't own one, and he'd never worn the other. But the next morning, Isaiah rode down to the ranch to pass word, and 3 days later, the children's mother helped Winona choose a ribbon for her hair. It was blue-gray, the same color as the ridges before rain. They stood before the preacher just after midday. The children gathered near the fence, their parents watching with quiet eyes. Isaiah wore his cleanest shirt, the collar folded stiff. Winona had washed her dress the day before and let it dry in the breeze, and the scent of wild sage clung to the hem. The preacher kept it simple. He asked if they'd stand beside each other, and they both said yes. Isaiah's voice didn't waver. When he reached for her hand, it was with the same calm certainty that had carried them through every day since she'd appeared in his life, like a hawk rising from the grass. Afterward, they shared bread and boiled eggs beneath the cottonwoods. The children passed around a fiddle one of them had learned to tune, and the music, though rough, filled the air like something sacred. That night, back at the cabin, Winona unpacked the satchel she hadn't touched since the day she arrived. Inside was a folded piece of linen she'd embroidered years ago with her initials. She laid it at the foot of the bed they now shared. Isaiah stood by the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel. "You never told me what the A stands for." "Alice," she said. "My mother's name." He nodded. "It suits you." She stepped closer, her hands clasped lightly. "There's something else. I found out last week. I hadn't said anything because I wanted to be sure." Isaiah turned, his brows drawn slightly. "What is it?" She reached for his hand and placed it gently over her middle. "I believe we'll have a child before the first snow." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he exhaled like a man grounding himself, his hand steady against her. "We'll make room," he said. "We'll build another wall if needed." "I think we'll need more than that," she said, a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. He touched her cheek, rough thumb brushing beneath her eye. "Then we'll build whatever is needed." In the days that followed, they planted early greens and stretched a canvas roof over a side pen for goats. Isaiah added a second chair inside, one he carved with a curved back so she could sit comfortably while sewing. Winona began to write lessons for the older children on scraps of hide when paper ran short, and Isaiah rigged a shuttered box to keep the slates dry when storms rolled in. They slept beside each other each night with windows open to the sound of night birds and the wind through the trees. Sometimes he woke before her just to watch the way her brow smoothed in sleep. Other times she rose first and warmed milk, the cabin quiet except for the creak of the floorboards and the soft whistle of the kettle. When her belly began to show, he spoke less, but his hands grew gentler, resting on the small of her back as she moved, lifting more of the weight without needing to be asked. She, in turn, began to hum while she worked, old songs from Kansas and new ones she made up as she went. The baby came in early November, just as the first snow dusted the hills. Isaiah boiled water and kept the fire high. The rancher's wife came when summoned, her hands practiced and calm. Winona gritted her teeth and bore down, her eyes never leaving Isaiah's face. When the cries came, first the child's, then her own, ragged and full of relief, Isaiah closed his eyes, one hand clenched around the doorframe. "It's a girl," the woman said. Strong lungs. Winona held her close, her skin damp but warm, her mouth already rooting. Isaiah sat beside them on the edge of the bed, silent for a long time, then leaned in to rest his forehead gently against Winona's. "What should we call her?" he asked. Winona looked down at the child's dark hair and said, "Ruth." "A good name," he whispered. "A name that lasts." Years passed. The garden grew wider, the goats multiplied, and the children from the ranch came more often, sitting cross-legged on the floor while Winona taught them not only letters, but how to speak with care. Isaiah built shelves for her books, then more for Ruth's. They never left the valley. They never wanted to, and every evening, after the tools were hung and the bread cooled on the sill, Isaiah would draw his chair beside hers, their knees touching, their silence easy. They had known loss. They had known solitude. But in the end, they had chosen each other, and in that choosing, they had built something neither of them had dared hope for. A life not just endured, but cherished. And they lived it together every day.